Eric Lamella's now starting to look the real deal and the boos ring out at the Woolwich. Welcome back, the Premier League. This is your e-Spurs podcast.
Come on, you Spurs! Come on, you Spurs! Come on, you Spurs! Come on, you Spurs! Tottenham, Tottenham, no one.
Hi guys, welcome to the e-Spurs podcast, your weekly fix of all things THFC. Don't forget, you guys out there, we want you to play a part in each and every podcast we produce. So make sure you subscribe to the show via iTunes or Acast, and even leave us a review on the page. That'd be much appreciated. And you'll get every new episode as and when it's released. Whatever your social media preference, we've also got that covered. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at e_Spurs, and you can like us on facebook.com/e-Spurs page, all one word. And also our YouTube page, don't forget that, where you'll also find the podcast and our new e-Spurs classic videos featuring some of the best THFC goals and games from throughout the years. For all the links to the platforms, just go to our website. That's www.espurs.blogspot.co.uk. On tonight's e-Spurs podcast, we'll review the opening game of the season at Goodison. I'll get the lads' reaction to the decision by Paul Mitchell to say adios to the lane as he leaves for pastures new. We also have your questions for the e-Spurs team, my favourite bit of the show each week. And if all that wasn't enough, we'll preview our return to the lane on Saturday as we host Crystal Palace in our first home game this season. So let's see if we can get through the next 45 minutes or so without commenting on the Woolwich, shall we? To begin with, let's introduce the team that I'll be talking to on all things Spurs tonight. It's Jason, Ricky, and a welcome back to John. How you doing, fellas?
Evening, mate. All good.
All good out here, mate.
All good, thanks, Andy.
Good. And as I say, we promise not to laugh at that lot down the road, and we'll try and get through the next 45 minutes without mentioning their game at Liverpool, although it got a bit sweaty palms there for a moment, didn't it? First up, I've got an apology to make. Last week I gave out a code for our fantasy football, which was completely incorrect, so apologies for that if you tried to log into our fantasy football last week. You can now do so, even though there's one game of the season gone. If you want to join the league, which I believe has around 160, just over 160 participants in already, just head to fantasy.premierleague.com, and the code to enter the e-Spurs League is 939 772 220847, and I promise that's the correct code. I'll give it out at the end of the podcast tonight, but thanks to all those who've already joined up with that. Now, I mentioned last week that I'll give a few mentions to a few people. We know that the e-Spurs podcast, there's listeners out there from various corners of the planet, and we really do appreciate each and every one of you who listen to the podcast every week and take the time out to contact us and have your say on the podcast. So just to give a few of those a mention, Trevor B at It's Trevor B from Richmond in Virginia, the States. Zane at The Ali Zane from Beirut in Lebanon. And a guy called Paul who contacted us on Twitter at _Paul G, and he says, I've never listened to the podcast before, but if you mention me, I'll start. So there you go, Paul. We're going to hold you to that, mate. We're going to check next week to see if you started listening to the pod, and I hope you enjoy it. And welcome to all our new listeners each and every week, and we really appreciate every one of you listening and taking the time to download the podcast. So on to the first game of the season, the Everton game on Saturday. Of course, we saw the debuts of Wanyama and Janssen in a Spurs shirt. Let's go first up to Rick. What did you make of the performance on Saturday, Rick?
First half was a little bit slow to start off with. I thought Poch must have had a word at half time because we came out much improved and we just seemed to go back into our natural selves second half. And I think towards the end of the game, we was very unlucky not to win it. But I have to say, Lamella is slowly becoming one of these special players, and we've had a few of these down the years that really looks like he could become some kind of player now, because he's turned into one of these guys that he doesn't necessarily have to now be playing well in order to affect the result. He's come up with important goals at important times. And I thought Janssen as well, second half when he came on, I thought he completely changed the game for us. And it was fantastic to see us have some kind of second option. I think a lot of last season when we didn't get the results we wanted was obviously it being labelled at Poch that we never had a plan B. Well, I thought partly Janssen's introduction was a plan B. And I still think, as I said, obviously to the lads before the pod kicked off, that I think we're still missing that maybe last chink in the chain in order just to give us these wins from draws. So if we could try and find that play in order to turn these points from the draws into wins, that would be great.
Certainly would. And John, welcome back to the podcast. As I say, mate, good to have you back. What do you make of the first half performance in particular? It was a fairly sluggish start, wasn't it?
I think it was just one of those where, a lot of our players have played hardly any minutes at all in pre-season, and I think it did show, to tell you the truth. I think once the adrenaline got going and the thought of, we're going to lose, maybe did make them up their game a little bit. But I just think that there's a little bit of rust there, which, can happen and does happen most of the time at the start of the season, and I think it's just down to lack of minutes really for most of the players that played. They wouldn't have had really, many of the players that started wouldn't have even had 90 minutes in pre-season. So I know Poch likes to do his double training and high intensity training and what have you, but you heard it being said all the time that you can't really replicate the speed and intensity of a game in training. So I think maybe it'll just be one of them where, similar to last season really, where we took a little bit of time to get going. But luckily, it didn't. We did pull our fingers out in the second half, and it ended up being a decent result. I would say it would have certainly a result that I probably would have taken if you'd have asked me after 7 minutes. But it weren't too bad in the end, I think.
Yeah, agreed. I was speaking to Ricky just now, and I think a point up at Goodison, especially at this stage of the season, early doors, players finding their feet, you're going to take that, aren't you? It's not a disgrace by any means. And Jay, we saw, as I say, the debut of Wanyama yesterday in a Spurs shirt, and Janssen. What did you make of our two new boys?
Well, Janssen certainly caught the eye, didn't he? Certainly put himself about and was doing the closing down that Kane usually does, but that Kane wasn't actually doing yesterday. So he certainly made a big difference up front, and the chance that he had, it just kind of fell a fraction behind him, didn't it? He just couldn't quite get enough power in his shot, but he certainly looked a useful addition to the squad. And Wanyama got his foot in, won lots of ball. Probably the downside of Wanyama is the number of free kicks he gives away, but sometimes that can be frustrating, but there'll be other times, I'm sure, when we'll be pleased that he does do the sneaky foul, and he is a bit clumsy sometimes, because sometimes you do need that when teams are breaking on you. But I thought the big star yesterday was Carl Walker, who I thought had a really exceptional game at right back, and gave us lots of pace and power down that right hand side, and of course Vaughan, who takes lots of flack, made that really crucial save, didn't he, just before half time? So, special praise goes to Vaughan as well.
Yeah, he certainly did. I mean, Rick, Vaughan is a player who has come in for a lot of flack, as Jay mentioned there, from Spurs fans during his time at the club. I've certainly been a critic of his at times, but yesterday he saved us at a crucial time, didn't he? Because 2-1 there, you're talking chance of coming back is pretty much nil.
If they went in 2-0 at half time, I think it would have been a very, very difficult game for us to turn around. And bearing in mind how off the pace it was in the first half, it may have been very hard to lift the players. So you've got to credit him for the save. I think also it's worth saying that although we have all criticised Vaughan in the past, I think we have to bear in mind that as a backup goalkeeper, it's very, very hard to just come straight back in without a regular run of games and expect the guy just to perform as Hugo does, because the comparison between the two, you can't compare. So it looks like, based on Hugo's injury, which appears to be a hamstring, that we may have Vaughan in goal for a couple of more games at least. So we're going to need him, and he's going to need all the support he can get. So let's hope there's a few more saves in his locker.
He's capable of doing that, isn't he? So, he's not a bad goalkeeper by any stretch of the imagination. I still think Poch might be on the lookout for another quality goalkeeper as backup for Lloris in the long term. But we shall see. John, in terms of the midfield yesterday, there was a few quiet performances in there, weren't there, yesterday, especially, as I say, first half. And in particular, the England trio, the Kanes, the Dele Allis and the Eric Dyers, had a really quiet game yesterday. Would you put that down to the summer exploits of these guys, or would you put it down to just being early in the season?
Possibly a little bit of both, but I think, like I just said a moment ago, you're coming back from... All right, if you take out the fact that they played the tournament, must feel still like pre-season to their bodies, if you know what I mean, because they all played against Inter, but I think that's it, and then they go in and they play yesterday. So it's one of those where he's not going to disrupt the team too much, I suppose. There would have been players in the squad who were perhaps fitter and further on in terms of their fitness, match fitness. But you're talking about the likes of Harry Winks and Tom Carroll, who have had plenty of minutes in pre-season. So I think you've got to, it's trying to find a balance between those players that are fit enough and those players that are good enough, and those players that they were quiet yesterday. But then I don't think anyone on the pitch really stood out. I think Everton still had the they had plenty of quiet performances as well. I don't think anyone really on their side, probably apart from Barkley, had a decent game. Delafeu was decent in flashes, but as Jay said, Walker was really good. But I think apart from that, offensively, it just weren't one of those. It was never going to be a 4-3. Sorry, I had to get that in there. It weren't ever going to be one of those kind of games. Just because Everton and Tottenham are similar in the way that they set up in terms of, it's about being solid first and foremost, and it does stifle those sort of attacking players. So I can't really have any worries, any complaints either about yesterday because, especially when you're number one and one of the best keepers in the world comes off and you're 1-0 down and you're thinking, oh God, here we go. But in Vorm's defence, I still believe that he would have been our number one plenty of times over the past 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
Because we've had keepers, undoubted number ones, who are probably not as good as Vorm is, in my opinion. So I think we've done all right yesterday. And the players that you mentioned there, they will come good. I know they will. Yeah,
there's plenty of time for that, isn't there? Jay, we've talked many times towards the end of last season about the challenges of this season with the Champions League and the various competitions. Having looked at the bench for yesterday, still looked pretty lightweight, doesn't it? Bearing in mind they've had 2 months to really pad out that squad for the challenges ahead, shall we say?
Yeah, there didn't look a lot of what we'd call game changers on the bench, with the exception of Janssen. Carter Vickers, Davis, Winks, Onumar, Mason. You looked at that and thought, if we are having to chase a game, there's not too many goals on there to bring us back. So it was a little bit of surprise maybe that Chadley didn't at least get an appearance on the bench. Whether that's a possible sign that he is definitely susceptible to leave the club in the transfer window. And of course, hopefully Son will come back now from the Olympics because Korea got knocked out this morning. So, he scored against Palace last year, didn't he, at White Hart Lane, got the goal. So, we certainly need 1 or 2 players on the bench to give us that threat of a goal to when they come on.
Yeah, as you say, a lot of youngsters on the bench, Jay. Is that a bench that you can see being a squad that can get out of the group in the Champions League? When you mentioned the likes of Vorm, Carter Vickers, Winks, Mason, Onoma, just playing devil's advocate here, they're going to struggle, aren't they?
Well, I mean, there's still time in this transfer window, and maybe it was one of those clever benches where the manager's effectively looking at the chairman saying, look, where's 1 or 2 extra reinforcements we need?
Yeah.
And of course, we still don't know whether the Nkudu deal will go through. But I think that the one surprise on the bench and amongst it all, I think we mentioned it briefly last week, is that Pochettino's press conference that said we had no injuries at all. Vertonghen would be back and there was no injuries, and yet there's still no sign of any Kevin Wimmer, and it was Carter Vickers on the bench in front of Wimmer. So it would be interesting to know what's going on with the Wimmer deal, because he had no pre-season minutes at all, and he seems to have disappeared behind Carter Vickers. And I think the other thing that you notice from the bench is that maybe Winks has now jumped in front of Tom Carroll on the future planning of the club.
There does seem to be these instances where players tend to go missing in this hole that seems to exist at Spurs training ground, isn't it? I think Eric Lamela disappeared into it for about 6 months a couple of years back when he first joined. But it's a strange one. I'm sure the truth will out, shall we say, in the near future. Putting a positive spin on it, as we try to do. Rick, yesterday 1-1 at Goodison. It's no disgrace, is it? It's a good platform to move on to the Crystal Palace game from.
Completely agree, yeah. I think when you take into account we're playing against a side with the whole new manager buzz, the fact we lost our goalkeeper, we went 1 down in the space of 5 minutes. It was the first game back from the players at the Euros, so naturally you expect that kind of maybe lethargic start. I think I take a point all day up at Goodison. It's not a bad result at all. But it'd be nice moving forward if we can try and turn, like I said at the start of the pod, these draws into wins. And I still feel, I know we're going to come on to it and discuss the transfer window, I still feel that we're maybe 1 or 2 players short from being able to have that game changer to come on and turn these draws into wins if we're realistically going to try and go for the league. And I have to bring it up and say that watching that Liverpool-Arsenal game today, as much as it pleased me seeing Liverpool beat Arsenal, I think both teams conceding 3-4 goals. You look at our defence on their day, we've got one of the most solid back fours in the division. So if we can just kind of carry that on and add a bit more up top, we've got a real chance for this league. And I don't think, I said last week, I don't think it's going to be a foregone conclusion in terms of the Manchester clubs. I think we're right in there if we can just tweak our side. So there's a lot of positives. And on to Palace next week. And again, if we're at our best, then it's a game that we most certainly can win.
So on to another subject that we're going to cover tonight, because just after we recorded the podcast last week, as often happens with these things, it was announced that our head of recruitment, Paul Mitchell, will be leaving Spurs after 2 years at White Hart Lane. In a statement, Daniel Levy said Mitch has been with us for 2 years and created a well-staffed department and run our recruitment process. We respect his wish to consider new avenues. A priority right now is the final few weeks of the transfer window. I know that while most of our business has been completed, Mitch is keen to ensure we start the season in the best position. So, came as a little bit of a shock, this one, didn't it, John?
I think it did, but then I'm not really worried about it, mate, to tell you the truth. I think there's a lot more things that I'd rather need attention more so than us talking about this. And I only say that because it's one of those where he's got a job, same as any of us. We've got a job, and if you get a better offer from somewhere else, you're going to go. And I think it's because I think maybe I feel like I do because it's not on the playing staff side of things, and the fact that Pochettino's now officially the manager and not just the head coach, maybe that's got something to do with it, whereby Pochettino's sort of taken over part of at least what Mitchell was doing. So I'm not really worried about it, to tell you the truth. And also think that he's got, if you think about the players who signed in the last 2 years, some, it's not like he's got 100% brilliant success rate, is it? So I don't think it's one of them where the club don't even sound like they're too worried about losing him, and nor am I really.
He was, having said that, John, he was a key ally of Pochettino, wasn't he? Brought in from Southampton, knew him from his days there. Pochettino's come out and said that he's gutted that he's leaving. Is there more to it than meets the eye for you, or is it just a case of wanting to move on to a new challenge?
Well, I mean, just because we don't know, that's what I would say. I think he's had a better offer from somewhere else. Maybe he feels Pochettino himself is stepping on his toes a little bit. And the fact is now Pochettino's been in England for, 3 or 4 years. And maybe he needed someone like Mitchell at the start to sort of help him acclimatise to the league and to just to take some of that burden off him. Maybe even if it's something as simple as you needed a bit more time to learn English, so you go and have a look at these players for me. You don't know. And I think it's one of those where now Pochettino is, he's been living in this country for a while and he knows more about the leagues and the players within those leagues. Maybe he feels he can do it himself. And there's got to be another. I'll be more interested in the reason for his Pochettino's title change, really, because I think if we knew, the things that he's now responsible for that he wasn't before, then we'd be able to say, well, this is why Paul Mitchell's not needed or he's leaving.
Yeah.
I think if the club was a little bit more transparent in the reasoning for changing Pochettino's title from head coach to manager, then it might have answered all of these questions for us already.
See, this is one of the frustrations for me of having, these multiple tiers that Daniel Levy likes having in place underneath him. The scouts, head of recruitment as he's called now, director of football as it was. You've then got the manager under him. You've got other scouts in there. And it does cause a bit of confusion, as you say, as to who's responsible for what. And Spurs are never transparent, are they, in these sorts of things, in people moving on and the real reasons for them. Having said that, not many football clubs are, but Spurs especially, it seems, like to keep things pretty closely guarded. He brought in Jay, Dele Alli, Toby Alderweireld, Son, Vincent Janssen, Wimmer, and Clinton Ng. And apart from Ng, I think we'd all agree most of those have been a big success. Dele Alli, Alderweireld especially. Are you more pessimistic about it than John? Can you see it having an effect on Spurs in the near future?
Well, I think, as John says, it's very difficult to know without knowing all the ins and outs of what went on. It seems a little bit strange that both Mitchell and the other chap's gone. Rob McKenzie, who's gone back to Derby, having joined us from Leicester, who was another one in the recruitment department. So the fact that two have gone at pretty much at the same time suggests that maybe there is a little bit of frustration there that there's interference from above, but it's really difficult to say. In terms of the ones that Mitchell brought in, I mean, Alderweireld was known anyway, and Wanyama obviously was known by Pochettino, who took him from Celtic to Southampton. So, they were hardly spotted by Mitchell from nowhere. And the jury's still out. Son, I think the talent's there, and I've got big hopes that Son will really kick on this year. But again, the jury's out, so it's difficult to know without we'll never know the full ins and outs of why they've gone, and perhaps for other reasons they'll never be able to tell us. But just one of those things I think that's happened.
We'll never know. Rick, would you like now to see him be replaced with another head scout, or would you like to see Pochettino be given full control over everything, including the transfers?
I'll be honest, when the news broke, I was slightly concerned, just in comparison to John, purely because, for me personally, I feel like Poch worked obviously with Mitchell at Southampton, and it's one of his closest allies at Spurs he's got there, and it's all very well, a lot of people are saying that he may have been stepping on Pochettino's toes. I mean, I personally don't see it that way. I mean, they kind of worked hand in hand. Mitchell kind of knew the players that Poch wanted, and therefore identified him on his behalf. Because as a manager, you can't be doing it all. People would say maybe Fergie did, but nowadays the way it works, the amount of time that goes into obviously the tactical side of the game, I don't think there's a time to do it all yourself, and therefore it's so important that it sounds like we're going to have to replace him. It has to be, for me, Pochettino's decision along with Levy. But I mean, I'd say Poch has got to have a big say-so in the next guy, because if they don't simply get on, then that is a massive concern. I mean, the most important thing to me is that Poch is happy. He's the most important thing to the club, irregardless of any player. For me, Poch is the most important person at the club, because if you lose him, you lose the team ethic, you lose the spirit. You may as well not have the players that we've got. He's kind of built this over the last couple of years, so it really is imperative that the move we're going to make now in terms of the next person coming in that's going to support him is firmly a guy that he can get on with. And that's why I was concerned during the week that the news broke, and a lot of people did seem to be of the fact that it may be a case that he was stepping on his toes. But Poch, in his interview, his pre-match conference, said he was very disappointed. He tried to get him to stay. I don't see why he would lie to us and say anything different. I think he does need to work with the director of football, whatever his head of recruitment, whatever the title is. And I just hope that the guy coming in is going to be someone that Poch is going to recommend, because it needs to be someone he can work with for the club to carry on in the way it is at the moment. It's a very, very positive atmosphere around the club. It seems like a very kind of family-tied unit at the moment in terms of the squad, and I just hope that's replicated in the boardroom as well, because it seems to be a case that Levy and Poch were kind of working together, and I just hope this isn't the Daniel Levy of old, where because he wants his own way, we're going to suffer for it. I really hope that isn't the case.
As I say, you've said many times on here, Levy loves this system, doesn't he? The director of football system, the multiple layers underneath him of management. But having said that, we heard last season that he was, getting on really well with Poch. It almost seemed that he was starting to finally trust the manager and trust his judgment, which we haven't seen in the past. We will see as to how much it affects Spurs. Let us know what you guys think out there. Is it going to affect Spurs? Is it going to affect Pochettino? Let us know what you think on Twitter at @e_Spurs and on Facebook e-Spurs page. Now, on to, as I say, my favourite part of the e-Spurs podcast each and every week. This is where you guys get to take over the show and ask the questions to the e-Spurs team. So let's get straight into it, shall we? Let's ask, first up, let's go to Jace. This is from Trevor B. He asked, does Eriksen need competition, and who are the potential options?
I think Eriksen definitely needs competition. He certainly lacks that little bit of consistency. There's no doubt when Eriksen's on Son, he's a fantastic player. We'd all appreciate that. But there are days when he's just, drifts around the game and nothing really happens. And yesterday was a prime example. And I think, anyway, every single person should have competition for places. Even Toby, even Hugo should have genuine competition. Otherwise, complacency sets in. So definitely, the difficulty is who, isn't it? I think probably we all quite fancy the look of Matar, and Matar's the same type of player as Eriksen. It's just a question of whether Pochettino would go for Matar with the doubts that he has on the work rate, which is why Mourinho sold him the first time round. But I think, if it was down to probably all three of us, we'd probably all quite happily see us go for Matar. But whether that's the one that we will go for, I'm not sure.
This has always been the thing, Jay, that's confused me about Eriksen, because for me, he's not what I'd call a Pochettino player, is he? He's not a player that will run 60 yards back to get the ball. He's almost what you'd call a bit of a luxury player, although I don't think he's got the quality of say a Berbatov, on his day he can be fantastic. But it's when his day comes around, and I mean, he's not what I'd typically call a Pochettino player, is he?
Well, I think it's quite deceptive because I know what you mean, and we don't think of him as being one of the workaholics. But I think last year's, I mean, I haven't got all the stats in front of me, but I think last year on the stats, he covered more ground than any other player.
Yeah.
So, which would suggest he does do his fair share of tracking back. And all right, we'll come to Eriksen later on the talking point. But there is that feeling that perhaps from his side, one of the problems with his contracts isn't so much down to the wage demands, it is the role that he's being played in, and that he does want to be more of a number 10 than stuck out wide and chasing backwards all the time. And you do feel perhaps there's other people in the team more physically able to do that, and perhaps a little bit tougher to do that than Eriksen himself. But certainly I think competition needs to come in. Like I say, I think every single player in that side needs genuine competition for places.
Yeah, it's certainly a good thing to have in any side. He's such an enigma of a player, isn't he, Eriksen? But on his day, as I say, quality player. John, this one's for you. This is from Fozman at Sean Foster 71. He asked, is the playing of both Dyer and Wanyama too defensive?
Well, I think yesterday showed that if you're playing the pair of them, then it does sort of stifle you in terms of having that midfield creativity coming from deep, because Dembele can do that job, and he does like to travel with the ball and, take players on and open up space for others by doing so. So I think he's right to tell you the truth. I think it does mean that you've got two players that are not really going to venture over the halfway line, which means you've got one less player to attack with. But then I still think that the way we attack with the high fullbacks, I remember last season reading a piece about the way in which we attack in zones. And if the fullbacks are high and you were to draw lines from one goal mouth to the other, it's quite difficult to explain on the podcast, but it basically means if the fullbacks are wide and you've got Kane and two attacking midfielders getting into the box, then we're attacking 5 zones, 5 forward lines at once, if you can picture that.
Yeah.
Because of having two players who are reluctant, shall we say, to travel forwards, it does mean that unless that ball into the area or that pass is spot on, then there's really not anyone coming up to support the attack from behind the striker. So yesterday, I think it definitely did show that they were both reluctant to go forward, and they both know that that's not their forte. I know Dyer scored a couple from long range in the past, but it's either a heavy deflection or bad goalkeeping usually that will allow that to happen. It's not one of those things where they're good at that necessarily, or that's their strength, and they realise that. And I think, to be fair, I think one of Everton away would have been one of them games where it probably does make sense to play that way, because it wasn't ideal that we went 1-0 down after 5 minutes, obviously, and it's not like it was an amazing goal or we got ripped apart. It was bad keeping, possibly, not very good defending, obviously, to let the ball get that far in. But if you take that out of the game, apart from the one save that Vorm had to make, I didn't really feel like it was much that, I didn't feel like, God, even when we weren't playing well in the first half, I didn't feel like we're going to be dead and buried by half time or anything like that. And I think it was because, in the main, of having Dyer and Wanyama there.
Next question tonight is Ricky. This is from Jad at MCJI4MO. A nice long, cheers for the username there. He asks, will Spurs sign a pacey wide player, do you think, before the deadline? Eriksen, in his opinion, this is his words, not good enough on the left. He's a number 10.
Well, if rumours are believed to be true, it looks like this Ndoklu is finally going to get over the line. Whether that's going to be a loan or a permanent, obviously we have to wait to see. In addition to him, I'd still like us to sign an alternative to Eriksen. I still want us to keep Eriksen. I've never said that I don't want us to keep, not want us to sell him, but like you've said, Andy, the problem with Eriksen is that he's not consistent enough, and his day, unfortunately, is not often enough. And I can only hope and pray that we are looking at an alternative to him on the days that when he isn't performing, we can change the game. Because I thought at the weekend he was very, very lucky to stay on the pitch. I thought at the time, I thought he may have brought Janssen on for Eriksen, but credit Poch, he went for it and decided to take Dyer off and really did go attacking. So we just need to have that competition for Eriksen. We really do, because at the moment he's playing without fear. As I've said on social media, we do need, like I said, my preferred choice would be Mata. And although people tell me that Mata isn't a Pochettino type player, my argument is that when Van der Vaart came to Spurs, because of his quality, you could allow him to not have to track back, because if you got the ball to him upfield, he would give you that kind of unique, special, great moment that some of the players couldn't do. So for me personally, I would sacrifice that pressing play if it meant having a luxury player that could create that moment of brilliance that changes these draws into wins.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about, isn't it? We know last season we had a bit of a slow start. We want to try and avoid that this season if we can. We've got a great opportunity against a Palace side who are in a bit of turmoil at the moment, losing a few of their best players. Didn't have a great result at the weekend, so you've got to feel that we go into that one, full of confidence, and a win there would certainly be a great springboard. So let's see. Other questions we had tonight we had one from Chris Duncan at Coach Chris _Chris83. He asked, what did you make of our debutants yesterday? That was the question I put to Jay earlier, so hopefully we've answered that one for you, Chris. And Trevor Lloyd at Trevor Lloyd 92, he asked, when Dembele is back from his ban, who starts in midfield? We've sort of answered that question, lads. Would you go with Dembele coming straight back in when he's ready? Jay?
Well, I think even the stats from last year show that our win percentage with Dembele goes up hugely. And, I mean, as John said, he's the player that links the back to the front, isn't he? He's so strong on the ball. He carries the ball forward. We know he's so powerful. So, for me, yes, definitely Dembele comes in. And then it's a question of whether it's Dyer or Wanyama that misses out.
I just love watching Dembele play. He looks as if he's got an age on the ball, doesn't he? Glides past players. Massive frame of a guy, and just quality in there. I know he was getting a bit of stick, wasn't he, in his first season at Spurs for not scoring enough, but I think now as Spurs fans we've all almost come to realise that is not essential for him, because he just adds so much to the creative side and the assist side of the game. It's fantastic to watch him in there as he's doing that, so I'm sure he will come back in. So Trevor, Chris, Jad, Fosman, Trevor, I hope that answers your questions. And guys, once again, thanks as always for getting your questions into us. We appreciate each and every one of them. And as I say, we'll try and answer as many as we can on every podcast. So do the same next week and get those into us on Twitter and Facebook. So let's look ahead, shall we? Second game of the season on Saturday, back at the Lane against Crystal Palace. A smaller than usual Lane, as we know. I'm sure you've seen the pictures throughout the summer of the work that's gone on. Huge hole in the corner of the east and north end of the stadium, so it's going to be a slightly strange atmosphere, I think, to begin with, as Spurs fans get settled in there to what the Lane looks like now. But in terms of the game itself, John, Crystal Palace, as I say, lost 1-0 at home on Saturday. They were also just about to lose Yannick Bolasie, who today it's revealed he's going to Everton. He's, I think, travelling up there for a medical. So is this a game now that we should win?
Well, obviously we hope so, and I think that on paper, then yeah, we should. I mean, Palace at home is one of those games where, all right, it's a London derby, a little bit of needle because Pardew's a bit of a tit. Their fans always like to give it as well, which cracks me up. But yeah, I think they're still a decent side. I'm not going to write them off, but yeah, we should be beating Palace at home really. And if you couple that with yesterday's result, then 4 points from Everton away and Palace at home would be a decent start to the season, in my opinion. So I'm hoping that we can get our home form this season off to a good start with 3 points.
And of course, Rick, we face the return of the old boy in Andros Townsend, who I'm sure would like nothing better than to get one over on his old boss, wouldn't he?
He would indeed, and show us we were wrong to let him go. But I think even he said this week that he said that he didn't perform towards the end of his spell at Spurs. So I think it was better for the player to move on. Let's just hope he doesn't come back to haunt us on Saturday. But in terms of the game itself, like John said, it should be a game that we're winning. Palace, like I said, John has just said, they've still got players in that team that can still hurt us, so we can't take them lightly. They knocked us out the FA Cup last year, so I'm hoping we'll get some revenge on them Saturday. And like I say, it will be a good return, 4 points on the opening two fixtures. It'll be a better return than we had from last season in terms of our start. So, and it's important as well we can get the points, because you've already seen this league. If we don't start quick, we don't want to be, we don't want to be out of it early. So it's very, very important we start the season well and then give the chance, like I say, the couple of new boys to bed in, and hopefully there's still a couple more to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And be nice to see a few more transfers before the end of the season. I'm sure we will. And Jay, in terms of the lineup that we're expecting to see on Saturday. Do you see it being the same 11 we saw last week, or could you maybe perhaps see us trying Janssen up there with Kane up top?
Well, I think after the second half, I think we'd probably all go and try and say, let's go 4-4-2 and put Janssen up front. But I still be surprised if Pochettino did that this early in the season. I still think he'll play with the two central midfield players and he'll start that way. The interesting thing would be is if you play one up front from Saturday's performance, who would you pick? Would you pick Janssen, who looked far more lively and far more likely to put himself about than Kane? But perhaps it's a little bit too early in the season as well for Poch to leave Kane on the bench and play with Janssen. So I'd be surprised if there's any changes, even though I'd like to see some myself. But I think we all know with Palace, they'll sit deep and they'll get everyone behind the ball and they'll just try and use Townsend and Zaha out wide. And particularly when our fullbacks wanting to bomb forward, you can see Pardew saying to those two wingers, get Chuk on your boots, try and get in and behind Walker and Rose, and let's see what Palace can do up front. And they'll play very similarly. That's how they came about us in that FA Cup tie. And of course, even though Bolassi's gone, I mean, that, you know, in fairness to Palace, that looks pretty good business, doesn't it? You bring in Townsend for 12 and you sell Bolassi for 26 million.
Yeah.
So that's not a bad bit of business from their point of view.
No, absolutely not. And Pardew's one of those managers, isn't he? You know, he's an arrogant so-and-so, as John pointed out there. But certainly got the better of us last year, and it's going to be a challenge for Poch to see if he can outthink him this time. And in terms of that bench, we're not really spoilt for choice still, are we? You know, in terms of who, until Son and Dembele get back, who can he bring in there? There's not many options. So I would think it's going to be roughly the same as we saw last season. Let's get some predictions, shall we? Let's go around the table. I should mention the predictions from last week, which I think Ian is the only one who got a spot on from last week. So I did mention we're going to do a bit of a league table this season and put a bit of pressure on the lads for their predictions this week. So if we're doing a league table, I think Ian is currently top of that table. I'm not going to mention who's got the wooden spoons. It's probably me down there at the bottom. But yeah, it's a bit of fun this season. So let's see how close we can get for this one. For Crystal Palace at home, second game of the season. John, your prediction?
Oh dear, this is definitely one competition I'm not going to win.
As long as it's not a 6-1, you'll be all right.
I'm going to go for a 3-1 home win on Saturday.
A 3-1 home win, lovely. Be a nice way to return to the lane. And Rick?
John beat me to it. I was going to say 3-1.
You're just playing it safe there, Rick, and you're thinking if John goes down, I'll go down with him.
It has to be that way, mate. Or otherwise we win together. Yeah,
absolutely. 3-1 both so far. And Jay?
I'll go for one less. I'll go 2-1.
And a 2-1. So we've got a couple of 3-1s, a 2-1. I'll put Ian's out on Twitter during the week. And I'm going to go for... I think there's going to be goals in it because there normally is. You've got two sides who like to attack, and I think it's going to be... I'm going to go... Do you know what I'm going to say? I'm going to put my neck on the block here. I'm going to say 3-0 Spurs. How wrong am I going to be next week? So if I'm not on the podcast next week, you know why. 3-0 Spurs and a 3-1... 3-1 and a 2-1. So let us know what you think, guys, on Twitter and Facebook. Let us know your predictions for the week ahead. Bit of fun, and we'll actually put that league table up on our website. So we'll name and shame myself and the lads on the e-Spurs website. That is your e-Spurs podcast for our second week of season 4. Thanks for listening, guys, wherever you are around the globe, as we always say. Don't forget to look out for the e-Spurs podcast Extra Time Show. That's our separate, smaller episode of the e-Spurs podcast, which is out every Thursday. Let's look forward to another week of football and hopefully a first Spurs win of the season. From Jason, from Ricky, from John and myself, have a great week, guys, and as always, come on you Spurs.